In 1284, Venice minted a gold coin so trusted that merchants from Cairo to London accepted it without weighing it. For over 2 centuries, the ducat held its value with mathematical precision. 3.5 grams of pure gold, never debased, never questioned. By 1500, it was still the most recognized currency in the world, and it was already dying. Lock in for the next few minutes. Because what killed the Venetian ducat wasn't collapse, it wasn't conquest, it wasn't even inflation. It was something Venice couldn't stop, even though they saw it coming. The ducat didn't lose its value overnight. It lost its function. Slowly, structurally, inevitably, and the danger wasn't in the price, it was underneath it. If this walk through financial history sharpened how you understand risk, take a moment to like the video. It quietly tells the system this work has value. Now, back to Venice. Picture the Rialto in 1450, ships from Genoa, Florence, Constantinople, Alexandria, all settling accounts in ducats. Not because Venice forced them to, because the ducat worked. It was convertible, liquid, stable. The exchange benches lined the canal. Merchants haggled in a dozen languages, but when the deal closed, they paid in ducats. Venice built an empire not on military dominance, but on monetary trust. The ducat was the plumbing of Mediterranean trade. Prices fluctuated, empires rose and fell. But the ducat remained constant. Ships came and went. Fortunes changed hands. Wars erupted and ended. The ducat endured. It wasn't just currency, it was infrastructure. At the time, this looked stable. What no one questioned was the structure holding it up. In 1284, Doge Giovanni Dandolo faced a problem. Venice's silver currency, the grosso, was breaking down. Other city-states were debasing their coins. Merchants were demanding gold. Trade was expanding faster than Venice's monetary system could support it, and Venice's entire economy depended on trust. So Dandolo did something radical. He created a gold coin with an absolute standard, 3.5 grams, 23.75 carats. No exceptions. He banned debasement under penalty of exile. He made the mint accountable to the Great Council. He turned Venice's currency into a contract, enforceable, transparent, predictable. Every ducat minted had to meet the exact specification. Master moneyers inspected each batch. Violators faced permanent banishment. The standard wasn't flexible, it was absolute, and it worked. Within 20 years, the ducat was the default settlement currency across the Mediterranean. Venice didn't need to conquer markets. The ducat did it for them. Merchants in Barcelona preferred ducats to their own currency. Banks in Florence held ducat reserves. Even the Ottoman sultans accepted ducats at face value. But the system had one quiet assumption baked into it. Venice would remain the center of trade. The ducat's value didn't just come from gold content, it came from Venice's position as the intermediary between East and West. The Silk Road ended at the Adriatic. Asian goods flowed through Venice. European silver flowed back. As long as trade flowed through the lagoon, the ducat was indispensable. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. For the next 2 centuries, Venice expanded aggressively. The ducat financed everything: war loans, shipping contracts, insurance, letters of credit. Venice became not just a trading hub, but a financial hub. By 1400, Venetian banks operated across Europe. The ducat was used in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire. Even rival cities like Genoa and Florence settled debts in ducats. Venice had created something rare, a currency that transcended politics. Wars between Venice and Milan didn't stop ducat circulation. Papal interdicts didn't devalue it. Trade embargoes created temporary disruptions. But the ducat always recovered because it was backed by something deeper than politics. It was backed by network effects. The more people used ducats, the more valuable ducats became. Not in gold content. That never changed. But in utility. Every merchant who held ducats made them more useful to the next merchant. But every success introduced a deferred risk. As the ducat spread, Venice lost control over velocity. Merchants hoarded ducats abroad. Bankers held reserves in other cities. The money supply that Venice minted was increasingly outside Venetian borders. Unintended consequence, Venice could no longer easily adjust liquidity. By 1450, an estimated 60% of all ducats ever minted circulated outside Venetian territory. Venice controlled the mint, but not the money, and as trade expanded, so did competition. Other city-states started minting gold coins. The Florentine florin in 1252, the Genoese Genovino in 1252. They copied the ducat's weight, its purity, its credibility. Venice had created a standard so successful that rivals could replicate it. The florin was nearly identical to the ducat. Same gold content, same trust framework, different city. Temporary stability became structural rigidity. The ducat's strength was its consistency. But consistency meant Venice couldn't adapt without breaking trust. If Venice debased the ducat, merchants would shift to florins. If Venice restricted ducat exports, trade would route around them. The currency that gave Venice power also constrained it. Every trade route secured, every alliance reinforced, every competitor imitating. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. Venice's eastern trade routes, the arteries of its commercial dominance, were suddenly controlled by a rival power. The immediate reaction was alarm, then negotiation, then adaptation. Venice paid tribute, signed treaties, maintained access. And the ducat remained stable. The gold content didn't change. The mint kept operating. Merchants kept using ducats. But something underneath had shifted. Pay attention to this part. The ducat's value had always rested on two pillars: intrinsic gold content and positional dominance. Now one pillar was cracked. Venice still controlled the currency, but it no longer controlled the flow. Trade routes that once terminated in Venice now had alternative endpoints. Ottoman merchants could deal directly with European buyers. Venetian intermediaries became optional. And the ducat, while still trusted, was no longer the only trusted currency. In 1488, Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. Suddenly, the route that had made Venice indispensable, with the overland connection between Europe and Asia, was obsolete. Spices, silk, gemstones, the high-value goods that justified ducats, could now bypass Venice entirely. Portuguese ships sailed directly from Lisbon to Goa. They paid in Portuguese currency, settled in Portuguese ports. The entire transaction bypassed the Venetian system. And here's the critical point. Nothing collapsed. The ducat still circulated. Venice still traded. The gold content remained pure. Venetian merchants were still wealthy. The Rialto was still busy, and that was the problem, because the infrastructure of trust was eroding. But the price signal hadn't adjusted yet. Ducat exchange rates remained stable through the 1490s. Venetian bonds still paid reliable yields. The system looked healthy, but the plumbing underneath was reconfiguring. In 1509, Venice faced the League of Cambrai, a military coalition formed by France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy. Nearly every major European power united against Venice. The war was devastating. Venice lost territory, lost influence, lost naval dominance. But still, the ducat held. Merchants still used it. Banks still honored it. The gold was still pure. The mint never stopped operating. Not during the siege. Not during the territorial losses. What Venice couldn't maintain was monopoly. By the 1530s, Spanish silver from the Americas was flooding Europe. New currencies emerged backed by raw volume, not just trust. The Spanish real became increasingly dominant, not because it was more trusted than the ducat, but because there was simply more of it. Liquidity shifted. The ducat remained credible, but it was no longer necessary. Merchants could settle accounts in reals. Banks could hold reserves in reals. The entire Mediterranean trading system could function without ducats. And in 1543, Venice made a decision. Faced with rising military costs, declining trade revenue, and mounting fiscal pressure, the Great Council authorized the first debasement in 259 years. Not dramatic. Just 2%. The gold content dropped from 3.5 grams to 3.43 grams. It was rational, defensible, even necessary given fiscal pressure. Every economist in Venice understood why it had to happen. The alternative was bankruptcy, but it broke the contract. For 259 years, the ducat had meant one thing: absolute consistency. Merchants didn't test ducats. They didn't weigh them. They trusted them. That trust wasn't based on Venice's goodwill. It was based on Venice's record. The ducat had survived wars, plagues, and political upheaval by maintaining absolute consistency. Now, for the first time, the standard had flexed. And once flexibility was introduced, trust became conditional. Merchants started testing ducats again, weighing them, comparing them to florins. The psychological contract, the thing that made the ducat more valuable than its gold content, was broken. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. The ducat didn't vanish. It circulated for another 250 years. Venice continued minting it. Merchants still accepted it. But its role changed. By 1600, the ducat was a regional currency, not a global one. The Spanish dollar, backed by New World silver, became the dominant settlement currency. Amsterdam replaced Venice as Europe's financial center. The florin, the pound sterling, the ECU all rose in relative importance. Venice remained wealthy. The city still had art, architecture, culture. Venetian merchants still operated across Europe, but they operated within a system they no longer controlled. Who benefited? The Atlantic powers, Spain, Portugal. Later, the Dutch and the English. They controlled new trade routes, new resources, new markets. Portugal monopolized the spice trade. Spain extracted silver from Potosi. Dutch merchants built a global trading empire, and all of them settled accounts in their own currencies. Who absorbed the cost? Venice, and everyone whose wealth was denominated in a currency that still worked, but no longer mattered. Venetian merchants were still wealthy, but their wealth was increasingly locked inside a shrinking system. A Venetian holding 10,000 ducats in 1500 was internationally powerful. A Venetian holding 10,000 ducats in 1650 was regionally comfortable. Same currency, different world. Power didn't shift because of war. It shifted because the plumbing underneath global trade reconfigured, and the ducat was no longer the standard interface. Trade routes moved, settlement systems evolved, reserve allocations diversified, and Venice, still minting ducats, became a spectator to the system it once defined. If you value analysis that treats financial history seriously, subscribing simply ensures you don't miss work like this. You're not watching this for a history lesson. You're watching because something about this pattern feels familiar. So let's be direct. The ducat's collapse wasn't a collapse. It was a replacement. The currency remained. The system moved on. And that's the distinction that matters in late cycle environments. Prices are the headline. Plumbing is the story. Today, we watch equity indices, bond yields, currency pairs. We track inflation data, employment numbers, GDP growth. But underneath, liquidity pathways are shifting. Reserve allocations are diversifying. Settlement infrastructure is fragmenting. History doesn't repeat events. It repeats incentives. Venice's mistake wasn't debasement. It was assuming that credibility alone could sustain dominance. They controlled the currency. They lost control of the flow. And when the flow moved, the currency became optional. Now consider modern reserve systems. The dollar isn't failing. U.S. Treasury yields are still the global benchmark. The Federal Reserve still sets the tone for global liquidity. But alternatives are being built, not because of distrust, but because of contingency. Central bank digital currencies, bilateral trade agreements settled in local currencies, regional payment systems like CIPS in China, commodity-backed settlement mechanisms. None of this is dramatic. None of it is immediate, but it's structural. And in late cycle markets, structural shifts happen slowly until they don't. The Venetian ducat didn't collapse in 1543. It became irrelevant in 1600. The difference between those two dates is everything. Because by the time price signals adjusted, the power transition was already complete. Ducat exchange rates remained stable through the 1550s. Venice still looked wealthy. The decline was invisible in the data, but the infrastructure had already moved. This isn't a prediction, it's a framework. Rolling top logic applies to currencies just as it does to markets. The system looks strongest when flexibility has already disappeared. Venice couldn't debase without breaking trust. They couldn't restrict Ducat exports without losing relevance. They couldn't compete with Spanish silver volume. The options narrowed quietly, year by year, decision by decision. And by the time the constraints became obvious, the outcome was already determined. So the question isn't whether the dollar will collapse. The question is whether the plumbing underneath dollar dominance is still expanding or quietly contracting. Are reserve managers adding dollar exposure or diversifying away from concentration risk? Are new trade agreements reinforcing dollar settlement or creating parallel infrastructure? Is the system becoming more flexible or more rigid? These aren't predictions, they're posture questions. And posture, not prediction, is what determines how you're positioned when the music stops. Two takeaways. First, about systems. Dominance is always conditional. Venice built a currency so trusted that rivals copied it, and that replication eroded exclusivity. The ducat succeeded because it was the standard. It faded because standards can be replicated, and because networks can route around monopolies. Credibility is necessary, but credibility without adaptability becomes fragility. The ducat couldn't flex without breaking trust. That inflexibility made it obsolete. Second, about human behavior. We anchor to stability. For 259 years, the ducat never changed. That consistency became its identity. Merchants built businesses around it. Banks structured reserves around it. Entire economies anchored to it. When it finally flexed, even slightly, the psychological contract broke. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The lesson isn't to fear change. It's to recognize when stability has become rigidity, and to understand that in complex systems, the moment flexibility disappears is rarely visible until you're already past it. Venice didn't lose because they made one catastrophic mistake. They lost because they succeeded so completely that adaptation became impossible. The ducat worked too well, for too long, under conditions that couldn't last. And when those conditions changed, the system that depended on them became optional. That's not a warning, it's just how plumbing works. If this helped you see the system more clearly, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not for predictions, but for perspective.